my mind at least, China is in a deflation. I think that the question is on how long will it stay in deflation. China is not new to deflationary episodes. What has really pulled China out of their previous deflationary episodes is the role of stimulus, is the rise of new technology sectors. In the current context, could we see that happening? It does seem like there is a lot of problems for Chinese authorities to work through.
전 세계의 중요한 이슈를 따라서 인터뷰를 또 해보고 현명한 투자자들의 의견도 들어보고 그래서 인사이트를 함께 얻는 세상 유익한 인터뷰 글로벌머니토크 오늘도 시작하겠습니다. 항상 함께 하시는 분이죠. 중앙일보 강남규 선임기자님 오늘도 나오셨습니다. 어서 오십시오.
안녕하세요. 강남규입니다.
네. 오늘은 중국 부동산 이야기네요.
그렇죠. 중국 경제 이야기.
중국 경제 막 다양한 이슈들이 있습니다만 최근에는 부동산 경기가 뭐 계속 흔들흔들하면서
그렇죠.
쓰러지는 회사들도 생길 것 같고 어떻게 봐야 되는지.
이 이제 거시경제적으로 중국의 성장률에 어떤 영향을 주는지 아주 그 수치에 밝은 이코노미스트를 섭외를 했습니다.
어떤 분이죠?
루이스 루 영국의 옥스퍼드이코노믹스 중국 담당 수석 이코노미스트.
옥스퍼드이코노믹스면 뭐 하는 회사입니까?
경제 분석 기관이죠. 거기에서 사실은 그 루이스 루 같은 경우는 저하고 인연이 옛날에 미국계 투자은행에 있을 때 중국 담당 이코노미스트로 이 당장 뭔가 이렇게 숫자가 궁금할 때 지금 그동안 이메일로 골드만삭스 모건 스탠리에서 근무하고 있었을 때 그래서 지금 이 상황을 어떤 상황입니까? 그러면 탁탁탁 숫자를 얘기를 하면서
설명해 줬어요?
설명을 해주고 이메일로 코멘트 딱 해주고 아주 친절한 말레이시아에게 친절한 여성입니다. 그래서 사실은 최근에 이제 그 투자은행에 있으면 일 부담이 많지 않습니까? 최근에 아이를 낳았어요. 그래서 이제 아이 키우는데 조금은 시간을 많이 할애할 수 있는 분석기관으로 옮겼죠.
조금 한가롭거나 일이 많지는 않은 곳인가 봐요.
자기 일정을 조금 조절할 수 있는 그런
실력이 있으니까 그냥 좋은 데 갔다가 바쁜 데 갔다가 한가한 데로 빠졌다가 다시 또 이 조절이 되나 봅니다.
그렇죠. 부럽죠. 우리 입장에서는 참 부럽죠.
그러게 말입니다. 자기 시간을 관리할 수 있는 게 진짜 부자인데.
인터뷰 한번 시작해 볼까요?
네.
루이스 또 이 인터뷰 응해 주셔서 감사합니다. 사실 비구이안 사태가 거의 일단락 됐는데 어떤가요, 실제로? 어떻게 뭐 자금 조달에 성공하긴 했습니다만은 그래도 그 비구이안 자금난이랄까 사태가 옛날에 헝다그룹, 에버그란데와 견주어서 어느 정도 심각했길래 그렇게 요란했을까요, 반응이?
The problem is that if you look at what is reported, it doesn't look as serious. Because if you think about the total country garden liabilities, it's actually quite small compared to, I suppose, the entire Chinese banking system liabilities, right? It's actually smaller than where Evergrande was. If you remember Evergrande in 2021, they did issues at Evergrande did start to come into become more pronounced towards the end of 2021. The country garden does have smaller liabilities, but the problem is that it doesn't really matter what the size of liability is if you're not able to even meet small coupon payments on a monthly basis, then it is more liquidity crunch than a solvency issue, I think. The thing is, country gardens problems are particularly pronounced. I would say that there's a lot of coverage and headlines around that because it was so big, right? And because we've always seen country garden as a high quality developer, and it was only until very recently that people start to have doubts around that. So I would say that it's not inconceivable that what is happening at Country Garden could happen to other property developer, and you could have a bigger property sector meltdown, I would say. But just taking a step back, right? So the property sector, by most estimates, are about a quarter of the country's GDP. The problem with the property sector is not so much the problems at developers. It's more of people's reliance on the housing sector in general. So I would say that to the extent that some of these problems at private developers could be could be providing opportunities perhaps for state-owned developers or providing opportunities for other kind of state-linked developers, then I think that could help prevent, at least minimize the problems to the property sector. But I would say that because I think authorities are very much focused on, the bigness, the size of the sector, I think they're very conscious of contagion risk. So I think there is a very strong political impulse there to prevent something big from happening. I suppose the world is watching because the biggest sector for the second largest economy is effectively the biggest sector in the world.
비구이안 컨트리 가든은 사실 좀 괜찮은 줄 알았는데
그렇게 위험한 부동산 개발회사는 아니었다는 건데.
아니었다는 거죠. 그런데 이제 그게 갑자기 자금난 위기는 아닙니다만은 자금난에 빠진다 그러니까 서방 미디어들이 조금 서방 이코노미스트들과 미디어가
약간 오버한 것 같다.
민감하게 반응했다.
네, 일단은 몇 가지 좀 사실관계도 좀 더 알고 싶은 게 있어서 비구이 위안의 부채 규모가 얼마나 많습니까? 그게 앞으로 이제 문제가 어느 정도에서 해결될지를 가늠할 수 있는 가늠자가 될 것 같은데, 그리고 부채의 성격이나 어떻게 파악하고 계세요?
So Country Garden has total liabilities of around 199 billion, so close to 200 billion in dollars. This is as of end 2022, based on their annual reports. So that's around slightly more than half of where Evergrande was in that context. The problem, as we mentioned in some of our reports, is that even though it has such a big debt burdens, most of that is concentrated in sort of your tier 3, tier 4 cities, so your weaker cities. So that means that the ability to meet these payments are in fact a lot bigger than the ability to meet these payments are actually a lot more stressed than perhaps some of the other developers. If you think about Country Garden's debt interest, so basically the interest payment debts, right? They're running at around 300 billion renminbi, which is again around half the size of Evergrande. So kind of a bit of a I suppose a sense check. If you think about the sort of 5% loan loss ratio. So if you assume that 5% of Country Garden debts would go into default, this really about I would say it's really about 15 billion Chinese yuan, and that actually does sound quite manageable for the system as a whole. But I think right now the problems at Country Garden is not what's on paper, how big the debt is. That's not really the problem. Is the problem is really that is impacting some of the confidence that we are seeing around investors, around households.
저 지급 의무라 그러죠. 이른바 이제 뭐 건설 대금 상거래 가운데서 발생하는 지급해야 될 돈, 그 돈은 상당히 큰 것 같아요. 2천억 달러에 가까운 지급 의무가 있긴 한데 그 중에서 이자를 지급해야 될 진짜 빚, 그 빚은 뭐 중국 돈으로 약 한 3천억 위안 정도로 그렇게 많지는 않다. 그렇게 많지는 않고 그 전반적으로 봤을 때 그 정도면은 옛날에 헝다그룹 사태의 절반 정도 수준, 그런 정도 수준이라고 얘기를 하네요.
아무튼 이게 결국은 뭔가 건물 지어서 팔고 분양하면 돌아가는데,
그렇죠.
그 중간에 스톱되는 바람에
지금 현재
막히게
뭐
되는 그런 거죠.
안 사고 있으니까. 루이스, 근데 최근에 서방 이코노미스트, 물론 뭐 중국 내부 이코노미스트도 이제 대부분 인정합니다만은 그 지방 정부가 부동산 개발이나 지역 개발을 위해서 설립한 금융회사, 이른바 지역금융공사, 영어로는 LGFV라고 얘기를 하던데, 그 사태가 비구이안이나 민간 개발업자보다도 상황이 심각하다라고 하는데 실제로 어느 정도나 됩니까 그게?
So these lower tier cities are also more, I would say that they are more reliant perhaps on LGFEs that are these. So these are financing vehicles that essentially were set up by local governments to finance infrastructure projects or property sector projects that perhaps do not necessarily have very healthy returns, right? So I think a lot of the LGFEs related projects, we've seen them being quite modest in terms of the returns that they offer. And that necessarily places a strain on local government finances. And the problem with LGFV debts and the problem with LGFV debts in general is that they're quite opaque. So generally, Chinese observers don't really have a very good up-to-speed data on the size of LGFV debts in different local provinces. But we do have approximations of certain provinces that do choose to disclose data. And what we've seen is that LGFV debt has, in general, decelerated since the 2018 and 2019. And a lot of that is driven by, authorities clamping down on some of these hidden or implicit debt. But that's still a substantial debt. And I think by our calculations, LGFV debt repayments over the next year would take up something like 30 or 40% on average of local government revenues. So these financing vehicles are actually a very big source of liability for local governments. So I think the contagion risk from the property sector is that some of these LGFVs have actually been quite reliant on the property sector. So what is happening is that over the last few years, as property developers start to run into challenges and troubles, local governments have decided to effectively turn to these financing vehicles, these LGFVs, to purchase land rights from property developers. So that would effectively helps look from a local government perspective. That helps them to inflate their land sales revenues, right? So it is more of an accounting, I would say, workaround for local governments. So over the last 2 years, we have seen that LGFVs have a bigger exposure to the property sector. But as we know, LGFVs are not actually property developers, so they can't actually transform some of these land that they've bought into housing, which means that the returns on the land that they've brought is probably not quite high. And that adds further strain on local government finances. And I think one of the key things that we are watching out for is how a slowdown in the property sector is going to affect some of the revenues and proceeds of these LGFVs at a time when their debt levels is so high. It's an interesting point because what we've been seeing is that over the last 2 years, we have seen a big push towards deleveraging. But actually, more recently, if you hear the tone from the State Council and from the Politburo, they've actually changed from debt reduction to debt stabilization. So there is a sense that perhaps the property sector as well as LGFVs is still very much needed for supporting growth. So I think there is a bit of a shift in tone when it comes to debt deleveraging. But it would given that the current problem is a confidence issue, it would require a lot more than a shift in government direction to turn things around.
LGFV 우리말로 지방금융공사죠.
예.
지방정부가 설립한 금융회사가 있어요.
그게 거기서 이런 부동산 회사에 돈 빌려줍니까?
땅을 좀 대여도 해주고. 그러니까 지방정부가 땅과 자금으로 출자해서 이른바 그 그림자가 뭐라 그럴까 그 페이퍼 컴퍼니 비슷하게 실제 회사를 설립을 해요. 거기에서 이제 땅과 지방정부가 출자한 땅과 돈을 바탕으로 해서 민간 금융회사로부터 돈을 끌어들여요. 그래서 이제 무슨 뭐 산둥성 내지는 뭐 윈난성 그런 데서 이제 도로도 짓고 택지 개발도 하고 그리고 이제 실제로 또 거기서 아파트도 지어서 분양도 하고.
우리나라 LH하고 비슷하네요.
그렇죠, 비슷하죠.
경기개발공사 뭐 이런 데하고.
그런데 이제 뭐 블룸버그 등 서방 미디어들이 추정하기는 이런 식으로 이제 그 중국의 지방금융공사가 토탈 조달에 한 돈이 9조 달러 정도 된대요.
그것도 역시 땅도 팔아서 갚으면 또 그 돈 갚고 이렇게 돌아갈
그렇죠.
텐데
정상적으로 돌아가는 건 상거래가 그러니까 부동산 경제가 제대로 굴러간다라면
근데 그 땅을 사는 게 이제 뭐 헝다나 이번에 문제가 됐던 그 컨트리 가든 같은 회사들이 사서
그렇죠.
또 아파트 개발해야 되는 거니까.
정확하게 말하면 빌리는 경우가 되게 많더라고요. 땅을 빌려서.
물론 그렇죠.
지방정부가 다 갖고 있으니까 중국의 사유주의 전통 때문에.
예, 한 가지 저도 질문 드려볼게요. 그래서 중국이 요즘 이 부동산 경기 문제와 관련해서 대책도 내놓고 금리도 내렸는데 중국의 인민은행이 금리 내린 게 약간 좀 해석의 여지가 있는 것 같습니다. 그러니까 1년짜리 금리는 조금 내려줬는데 5년짜리 금리는 그대로 동결한 걸 놓고 이게 왜 그랬을까? 5년짜리 금리가 특히 부동산 경기에 좀 더 밀접한 영향을 줄 텐데 그래서 최근에 뭐 모기지 금리를 내려주기도 했습니다만 어떤 식으로 해석을 해야 되겠습니까?
It's a good question because I think going into the PBOC decision, we had all expected that they would cut rates across the board, right, including the 5-year benchmark rate. The fact that it didn't happen suggests to us, well, one thing is that the central bank is very much focused on banking sector profitability, right? So lower interest rates mean that their net interest margins is going to be lower. So given that, given that in a economic downturn, the Chinese authorities are relying on the state-owned banking system to support the economy, you need to keep these banks at a healthy, profitable level. So that's consideration number one. Consideration number two is that if you look at the existing mortgage rates of some of these, the existing mortgage rates for home buyers, it's actually much higher than the benchmark rate. So really, lowering that benchmark rate is not going to make much of a difference if there are no other guidance in place to lower the existing mortgage rates. So what will be more effective really is to allow banks to basically reprice the existing mortgage rates rather than for the central bank to come in and lower a benchmark rate. So I think in that context, it makes sense that they didn't move on the 5-year loan prime rate. And the 5-year loan prime rate, as we know, is a benchmark for mortgage rates in China. Now, the whole optics around that is not very helpful because, as we said, this is a confidence crisis, right? If you have mixed signals on policy, that is not really going to help support investor confidence. I mean, if I was PBOC, they have been, as you know, they have been cutting rates by 10 bips, 20 bips, well, more recently 15 bips to the benchmark, MLF. If I were PBOC, I would probably, at this current juncture, I would probably cut rates at 50 bips or 100 bips at one shot, just because I think that's what the economy needs to boost confidence. I don't think there is much help cutting 10 or 20 bips. So I think when it comes to the PBOC, some of these measures are perhaps still a lot more symbolic than they are meaningful.
기존 주택, 지금 현재 주택 소유자들이 이미 빌려 쓰고 있는 돈의 금리가 상당히 높은 수준이기 때문에 그걸 깎아주는 게 오히려 그렇게
확 내리기에는 또 부담이 있다는 뜻인데.
그렇죠.
네.
단지 이제 그 민간 개발 회사라든지 그 뒤에 있는 각종 투자 신탁, 그림자 금융이라고 하는 투자 신탁, 그런 회사들이 유동성을 확보하는 데 필요한 1년짜리 또는 그 1년짜리 인하하기 이전에 아주 그 단기 자금 금리도 내려주고 그랬습니다.
예.
사실은. 그래서 유동성, 펀딩에는 문제 없게 해주는 쪽으로 움직였다.
전체 금리를 낮추기보다는 지역적으로
그렇죠.
필요한 곳에 자금을 투입하는 쪽의 정책을 선택했다는 말이죠.
루이스, 중국 정부가 부동산 경기를 살리기 위해서 적극적으로 움직이지 않아 문제를 더 키운다라는 지적이 있었습니다. 거기에 대한 응답 차원인가요? 최근에 이제 중국 정부가 움직여서 이른바 자기 돈의 비율, 주택을 살 때 자기 돈을 얼마 최소한 갖춰야 되는, 준비해야 되는 자기 돈의 비율을 좀 낮춰줬습니다. 이게 어떤 의미인가요? 부동산 경기를 좀 되살릴 수 있는 좀 그런 그 자극제가 될까요? 어떨까요?
If you look at the existing down payment ratios that households face, as well as some of the restrictions that they face, they're still at quite restrictive levels. So there's still definitely room to ease on the property side. And I do think that stabilizing the property sector would be, one of the key things to reviving, to putting the growth momentum of the economy on a firmer footing. So that's probably quite important. I would say that the next thing that we would expect authorities to do is to really help to keep liquidity conditions quite accommodative, and that is important because I think even though they haven't really been very proactive in building out, for instance, Country Garden, or in resolving some of these bigger developer problems, I think it's still quite critical to ensure that liquidity and credit supply is still quite ample to the other developers so that they are still able to complete, some of these projects that are perhaps pre-sold, so that there is still property activity that can continue. So keeping liquidity conditions ample is likely the next step. Of course, given the excesses that we see in the property sector, the fact that there is still a very high oversupply in the system. I think this is a process that would take years. But perhaps compared to what we thought before, we had thought that the property sector correction would be more perhaps L-shaped. I think now, given authorities' willingness to perhaps let some of these single names undergo bigger stresses, I think perhaps the correction process for the property sector is perhaps more like a staircase, if you like, just kind of going down in a more gradual way. So I would say that the end game for the property sector is perhaps one where the economy relies less on the housing sector in general, but that is a very long process, and that means that over the next 2 or 3 years, we're likely to see more pain coming from the property sector.
예, 그 요즘 중국과 관련해서 나오는 앞으로 미래 상황에 대한 가설 중에 하나가 중국의 부동산 가격이 급격히 하락하게 되면 이제 부동산 구입하기 위해서 돈 빌린 부채만큼의 가치도 안 나오는 상황이 벌어질 수 있고, 그렇게 되면 결국은 부동산 구매자들의 자산이 축소되거나 사라지는 문제가 생겨서 일본의 그 부동산 거품 꺼진 후에 벌어졌던 이른바 대차대조표 불황, 빚만 많아지고 자산이 사라지니 사람들은 그 빚을 다 갚을 때까지 주머니를 열지 않고 소극적인 투자와 소비 활동을 계속 이어가고 있는 이제 그런 상황이 중국에도 올 수 있다. 그럼 중국이 일본처럼 잃어버린 몇십 년이 시작될 수 있다는 뭐 분석 예측이 좀 있는 것 같던데 어떻게 보십니까? 그 의견에 대해서는?
So I think in China's case, the way I would see it is that there is still more signs that they are able to come out of this without a balance sheet recession. I'm still a little bit more positive on that, but I think that is perhaps a more general statement. The property sector is definitely going through a balance sheet recession. We have seen, for instance, a lack of investments going into the property sector because people are worried about, property sector debt. So that is a very classic balance sheet recession that's happening in the real estate sector. But outside of the real estate sector, I think we have seen that, Chinese corporates are in general not really deleveraging. The pace of debt growth have slowed, but they are not really deleveraging, which is, I think, a very key point to note, because I think in the case of Japan, we have seen very sharp deleveraging that's been happening. In China's case, and outside of the property sector in China, we haven't really seen evidence of that. And I think it's also interesting to note that in Japan's case, there's been a lack of, I would say, the inability to recycle cash is because people are channeling, corporates and households are channeling extra cash to paying down debt. In the case of China, households, for instance, are building up cash, but they're not really paying down debt. They are more keeping it in banks because they are more cautious about the outlook. So it's a confidence issue. It's not so much that they're not spending because they have a big debt burden. And I think that's a key issue between the balance sheet recessions that we've seen in Japan and perhaps in China is more perhaps it's more accurate to call it a balance sheet deterioration, not rather than a recession. But having said that, I think that if it's easy to say that China's, I would say, stress is because of a confidence issue, but we have to remember that also in Japan, it started with a confidence issue too. So the government clearly has a very big role here to play to offset some of the stresses in the system. And I think one final point I'll make on the comparison with Japan is that in the case of Japan, we actually have seen a pretty sharp asset price crash, and that is important because the asset price crash effectively destroyed the balance sheet on the asset side for a lot of corporates as well as households. In China's case, given where property prices have come down, they haven't really come down as much as the case of asset prices in Japan. So clearly, we have not seen a price crash. We have not seen the kind of damage to balance sheets in China. So I think from that alone, it does seem like China is, going through some stress periods, but not quite a balance sheet recession, I think.
루이스, 그런데 그 아까 말씀하셨던 대차 대조표 침체에서 가장 중요한 요소가 저는 제가 생각하기에는 디플레이션이라고 합니다. 봅니다. 근데 디플레이션 증상이 사실 소비자 물가 지수의 상승률이랄까, 공장 출고가, 이른바 생산자 물가 지수의 상승률이랄까, 최근에 참 디플레이션 초기 증상은 분명히 나타나고 있는데, 그렇더라면은 일본처럼 대차 대조표 불황으로 가지 않을까요? 왜 그러냐면 디플레이션 때문에 미래의 빚의 무게는 시간이 흐를수록 늘어나기 때문이죠. 그래서 빚을 서둘러 갚을 것이다. 그럴 가능성이 없잖아 있다라고 보이는데 어떤가요?
In my mind, at least, China is in a deflation. I think that the question is more on how long will it stay in deflation. And I think the answer to that is that if you hear what authorities are saying, and of course, I am sitting outside of China, I try to be a bit more objective. But if you see what the authorities are saying when it comes to the inflation data that they publish, there's still a sense that the deflation that we are seeing in both producer prices as well as consumer prices is transitory, right? And of course, transitory is a favorite word for policymakers nowadays. But if you look at the data, it does actually agree with the authorities that these are transitory, right? I mean, CPI is in negative territory, but a lot of that is driven by, the weak pork prices or weak energy prices, and that will go away. And in fact, our forecast is that China will revert to positive inflation on the consumer price side by Q4. For the year as a whole, China's inflation will be around 0.5%. It's still quite weak, but it's nowhere near, deflationary territory. So I think that's one thing that's positive to note. The other thing to note is that China is not new to deflationary episodes, right? I mean, in 2012 to 2016, we've had 4 years of PPI deflation, and then we have 2 years after that of CPI disinflation. So China is not new to lower prices. And what has really happened, what has really pulled China out of their previous deflationary episodes is the role of stimulus, is the rise of new technology sectors. So essentially new growth drivers that help pull demand up eventually. In the current context, could we see that happening? We certainly have seen some stimulus coming into play. There's certainly some optimism around new industries in China right now, especially in clean energy, renewable energy, advanced manufacturing. These are sectors that continue to have potential to pull demand up. So I don't necessarily think that China's deflation is going to persist long, but it does seem like currently, the fact that there is a deflation, there is a property sector downturn, there are stresses on the currency, it does seem like there is a lot of problems for Chinese authorities to work through.
좀 전에 여쭙던 대차 대조표 불황으로 연결되지는 않을 것이다라는 답의 연장선상에서 그러니까 그렇게 되면 뭐 장기 디플레도 오겠습니다만 그건 아직은 여전히 일본에서만 발생했던 일인 것 같다. 중국은. 제가 질문 하나 좀 드리겠습니다. 그 중국의 위기를 바라보는 여러 시각 중엔 중국의 여러 경제 주체들 이 위기를 맞을 수는 있겠으나 아직 중국 정부의 부채 수준이 다른 주요 선진국에 비해서 낮아서 GDP 대비 중앙정부 부채 비율이 높지 않아서 여차하면 중앙정부가 그 빚을 떠안고 국영화하는 방식으로 위기를 헤쳐나갈 수 있는 여력이 여전히 있다. 라는 식의 설명을 하고 있습니다. 그래서 그건 이제 중국이 위기에 빠질 거라는 그런 전망을 이제 반박하는 근거로 쓰이는데 그런 여유분이 있다고 보십니까? 어떻게 생각하십니까?
I think the point you made is interesting because if you were to assess the ability for the authorities to, I would say, bail out or do bailouts or to essentially take on more public debt, I think on those metrics alone, which is debt to GDP ratios, it does seem like the Chinese authorities do have the room and ability to effectively do more stimulus and bail out entities that may be in trouble. So I think that is perhaps the most comforting thing in this current scenario. But the problem is, I suppose, the way we see this, that it's not really the Chinese economic philosophy to conduct these type of a rescue, if you get what I mean. I think generally there is a sense that when it comes to crisis, the central government's focus has always been to raise employment. That is the way that they have approached crisis in the past. That is their approach now. And I think that the best way to do that is through stimulus into businesses, through tax cuts that will support employment for the people in China. So that's kind of the approach that they've been taking, which is why we haven't really seen some of these big scale bailouts of stressed entities or massive cash transfers into households. It really is, more of a economic philosophy question, I would say. Now, there is a sense, of course, that if you look at Taiwan or if you look at Hong Kong, could they have perhaps just given households some cash to raise consumption patterns and to boost growth? They could have, but I think that the risk is that you create a very dangerous precedent, right? So people are going to expect that would happen in future. Similarly, for the property sector or for some of these stressed private sector entities, if you build them up now, I think the central government's concern is that it creates an example for future instances where you become overly reliant on the state for building up some of these entities. And I think that's absolutely what they want to avoid. What we have been seeing is that they have tried to move the debt risk around from the most risky entities to the least risky entities. I'll give you an example. For instance, we have seen a shift in the property sector debt from developers to LGFEs in the last 2 years. And right now we've seen central governments being very focused on shifting the debt of LGFEs into local governments on balance sheet debt. And then we've also seen that they've asked basically the banking system to take on some of these LGFE debts or to restructure some of these LGFE debts. So if you think about it, the risk in the system is effectively moving from the property sector to opaque financing vehicles in the local governments to perhaps safer pair of hands in the banking system. So really, the risk itself is not really smaller or bigger. They haven't really changed much, but they have moved from riskier parts of the economy to safer parts of the economy. And I think that perhaps is more of it speaks to really the kind of mild correction that the central government is more interested in. I think they're not really interested in the kind of big adjustment process for the economy, which is also why I think the stimulus that we see now has also been quite mild. They haven't really been very interested in large scale spending to support any particular segment of the economy.
사실 뭐 사태가 악화되면은 구제금융을 해야 되겠죠. 예. 그러나 중국 정부는 현재 중국 정부의 경제 정책을 담당하고 있고 그다음에 또 정치 권력을 담당하고 있는 사람들이 그런 식의 어떤 구제금융을 개별로 시중은행이나 금융회사에 투입하는 방식으로 민간 부채를 공공화하지 할 그런 철학은 안 가지고 있다. 그 철학에 맞지 않다라고 말을 하네요. 뭐 귀뜸이고 실제로 뭐 위급한 상황이 되면은 뭐 그렇게라도 해야지 어떡하겠습니까? 사실은
네. 소방에서도 뭐 그게 좋아서 하는 건 아니니까.
좋아서 하는 건 아니니까.
철학에 맞아서 하는 건 아니니까. 대체로
그렇죠.
철학은 나중에 만들어지죠.
네. 루이스 그러면은 사실 뭐 이런 질문 사실 제가 좀 과거에 인터뷰할 때도 직설적으로 물어보고 그랬습니다만은. 심각한 상황이 아니라고 말씀하셨는데 그렇다면은 지금의 중국 경제 상황을 뭐라고 불러야 될까요? 위기입니까? 아니면 그냥 단순히 스트레스가 좀 가중되고 있는 상태입니까?
I would call it a crisis, but I would call it a managed crisis. I think that it is very clear that the impact of the property sector on the broader economy is unexpected for authorities. It's very clear that they were caught by surprise, which is why I think the measures to support the economy have been very much forthcoming. I would characterize the stage of Chinese economy as sort of a slowdown before pivot, right? So if you imagine you're driving a car and you are trying to make a turn, just right before you do that turn, you would have to slow down. So this is the slowdown process. It's the slowdown that comes before the economy turns towards more sustainable growth drivers. So this adjustment process is necessary, and it's one that perhaps is I think a lot of analysts out there is expecting that this adjustment process will come much later in a decade. But the fact that, President Xi is very much focused on bringing it forward, that is why we are seeing the slowdown being more pronounced now.
사실은 크라이시스는 어떤 그 변곡점과 같은 의미를 띌 때가 많거든요.
예.
근데 분명히 중국은 사실 여러 가지 상황에서 위기 증상은 보였죠. 그러니까 그 지방 정부의 부채 상황이라든 전반적으로 이 사회 전체의 부채 비율은 어마무시하게 높거든요. 그게 그 덕분에 그렇게 높아진 배경에는 2007년에 그 공격적인 경기 부양, 세계 경제를 우리가 이끌어 보겠다며 야심차게 했던 그 후유증도 있고요.
있긴 있는데.
예. 그러나 이제 그 자체가 그 중국의 지금 현재 권력을 담당하고 권력을 쥐고 있거나 경제 정책을 담당하는 사람들의 소나기에서 벗어나서 관리 못할 정도의 단계는 아니다.
자, 마지막으로 질문 하나만 더 드릴게요. 그러면 이제 비구입 위한 사태도 대충 이렇게 일단락도 되고 흔들림은 있겠으나 파국은 아닐 것이다 라는 결론을 인정한다면 올해 한 해 2023년에 중국의 경제 성장률 예상치를 대략 어느 정도로 보십니까? 중국 정부는 한 5%대 얘기했는데 연초에는 너무 엄살이 아니냐고 하다가 실제로는 야, 저것도 쉽지 않을 수도 있어 라는 쪽으로 바뀌는 것 같기는 한데요. 어떻게 보세요?
If we were to kind of take an example from history and try to quantify the macro effects, what we are seeing using our in-house model is that if you have a much sharper correction, if you have spillovers from the property sector onto, residential investments, onto household consumptions, the kind of impact that we are looking at is about 0.5, 0.6 percentage point below our baseline. And our baseline is around the Chinese growth target of about 5%. So we could see growth at about 4.4, 4.5% this year. And that is quite a big slowdown in a year where the Chinese economy is supposed to have undergone a big bang reopening. I would say that the impact for the rest of the world is probably a bit more marginal, given that historically we haven't seen much of a spillovers from. But of course, that kind of a quantification exercise doesn't really take into account the ability for governments to step in and offset that with stimulus.
최근에 비구 위안 사태 등 부동산 시장의 충격이 중국의 경제 성장률을 0.5%에서 0.6% 포인트 정도를 깎아먹을 것 같다.
그러니까 5 조금 넘을 거에서 4% 중반대로.
거기서도 좀 깎으면 대충 4.4%에서 4.5% 사이 그 정도의
성장이 있을 것이다.
그런데 그건 나쁘지 않다. 그거 아닙니다. 사실은. 지난해의 기저효과를 따지면
그렇죠. 이미 망친 경제에서
그 정도
성장밖에 못한다는 건
그것도 성장 목표를 밑도는. 그러니까 사실 그 중국이 밉던 곱던 우리 글로벌 경제의 2023년 IMF 계산으로 2023년 글로벌 경제 GDP의 증가분이 있지 않습니까? 뭐 몇 천억 달러. 그 가운데서 중국이 기여하는 몫이 거의 40% 가까이 됩니다.
글로벌 GDP에서? 그래요?
증가분해.
증가분에서?
증가분해. 미국이나 심지어는 그 계산치를 보게 되면은 미국을 포함한 북남미 아메리카 전체보다도 많아요. 그러니까 사실은 현재의 중요한 성장 엔진이죠.
그러네요.
성장 엔진이 이 정도의 4.4에서 4.5 정도 정도 성장하는데 그칠 것으로 이제 서방의 민간 인디펜던트 경제 분석 회사들, 독립 경제 분석 기관이 이렇게 말을 한다. 사실은 그 아시아 등 한국 등 아시아 경제에 미치는 영향은
적지 않겠죠.
적지 않겠죠.
뭐 중국의 상황 늘 항상 들여다보는 아주 경험 많고 권위 있는 이코노미스트의 이야기를 직접 들었는데 전반적으로는 약간 호들갑 같기는 합니다. 라는 게 결론이었네요.
그렇죠.
자, 오늘 인터뷰는 여기서 마무리하겠습니다. 인사하고 마무리하죠.
그렇죠.
네, 고맙습니다.
감사합니다.
네, 오늘도 매우 유익한, 매우 유익하다는 게 이제는 뉴스도 아닙니다. 항상 유익하기 때문에 여러분들 좀 지겨우시겠다. 유익함의 지겨움을 경험하고 계십니다. 저희가 요즘은 이제 중국 이야기를 좀 중점적으로 전해드리고 있어요. 다음 인터뷰가 혹시 뭐 예정되어 있는 게 있으면
그 자연과학을 전공하고 이 증시를 분석하기 시작하는 사람들이 꽤 우리 유명한 사람들이 있지 않습니까?
이과 애널리스트.
예. 이 뇌나든지 기타 인간의 어떤 그 인식 능력을 전공한 사람이 그 경제학자로 전향한 경우예요. 비열한 시장과 도마뱀의 뇌의 저자.
책을 쓰신 분이요.
책을 쓰셨죠. 그래서 이제 그 책의 저자한테 제가 최근에 이제 그 시장에 사실 뭐 요즘 시장을 어떻게 봐야 돼? 글로벌 시장을 어떻게 이해해야 할까?
네.
거기에 대한 기본적인 메탈로직이라 그러죠. 밑에 이제 어떻게 봐야 할 것인가.
좀 큰 이야기.
예, 큰 이야기. 시장을 보는 어떤 뭐랄까 기준점. 그래서 우리가 왜 주식시장에 투자할 때에 곧잘 범하는 실수가 있는데 그 범하는 실수는 우리의 뇌가 도마뱀의 뇌의 수준에서 아직 덜 진화했기 때문에 그런 일이 발생하고 있다라고 이제 진단하는 사람 전문가입니다. 아주 흥미로운 재미난 그 이야기꾼이라고 것이라고 제가 믿기 때문에
내가 팔면 오르는 이유.
예. 한번 그 요즘 금융시장에 대해서 한번 그 새겨볼 수 있는 틈 그런 틈을 좀 가져보시죠.
네.
예.
자 그럼 또 저희는 다음 시간에 재밌는 인터뷰로 인사드리겠습니다. 고맙습니다.
감사합니다.